carved fragment of ivory, no bigger than a hand, shows a sphinx caught mid-stride. On its underside, out of sight once mounted, a Phoenician letter was cut into the surface. Not decoration, but a keying mark, the kind a craftsman scores into furniture inlay so the pieces go back together in the right order. It is a workshop instruction, buried inside a royal find. The Book of Kings closes its account of Ahab with a single administrative clause. Among his acts was the ivory house that he built. That is the entire textual record of it. No description of its size, its shape, or where it stood. And yet at Samaria, the city Ahab's father Omri had founded as his capital, excavators digging in the early 20th century recovered a cache of carved ivory fragments, numbering over 200 in their first published count. Furniture inlay, not architecture, pulled from debris north of where the royal palace had stood. One clause, one cache. The two were joined almost on sight, and that joining is the subject of what follows. Samaria itself came out of the ground in two distinct building phases. The first, dated to Omri, was a fortified summit enclosed by a thick wall of finely cut ashlar blocks with a large courtyard building at its center, almost certainly the royal residence. The second phase enlarged that summit with a wide casemate wall, nearly doubling the enclosed area. Excavators assigned this second phase to Ahab, Omri's son and successor, reasoning that a king who inherited a capital would be the one to expand it. It was into the debris near this second phase that the ivory cache turned up, in a zone the excavators began referring to, in their own notes, as the ivory house. Amos, writing as a prophet against Samaria's elite generations later, condemned houses of ivory and beds of ivory as emblems of excess. A detail from outside the narrative of Kings that at least confirms ivory-furnished houses were a known feature of the city, whenever exactly they were built. The ivory itself tells a story of craft and trade. Many pieces bear those Phoenician keying letters on their undersides. Some are unfinished, which suggests the carvers were working on-site rather than shipping in a completed product. The imagery ranges across sphinxes, exotic animals, and foreign deities, a visual language that points toward the Phoenician coast, the same coast named in Kings as Jezebel's home. She is introduced as a princess of Sidon, married to Ahab. It is a short step from there to assuming her marriage brought Phoenician craftsmen and Phoenician taste into Samaria's palace. And some modern commentary takes that step explicitly, describing the ivory house as built for her. But the text itself makes no such claim. Kings records the marriage in one place, and the ivory house in another, and never draws a line between them. That connection belongs entirely to interpreters working after the fact, filling a gap the record leaves open. The excavator's identification of the find zone as Ahab's ivory house was made with real evidence in hand, but also with the text already open in front of them. They knew the verse before they had the fragments. And by their own account, the biblical phrase shaped how they read what they were pulling out of the ground. That is worth pausing on, because it runs in the opposite direction from how the relationship is usually described. The dig is popularly said to confirm the verse, but an excavation report from the era states plainly that the excavators were inclined to attribute the entire ivory corpus to Ahab's reign, guided in part by that same scriptural reference to a house of ivory. The label came first. The stratigraphy came after, and stratigraphy is where the identification runs into trouble. Later scholarship split sharply on how much of the ivory can actually be pinned to Ahab's reign specifically. One line of argument assigns only a portion of the corpus, a high relief group, along with the earliest fragments recovered by the first excavation team, to Ahab's era. A separate, low-relief group is read as stylistically closer to 8th century ivories excavated at Nimrud, the Assyrian capital, which would place that portion not in Ahab's reign at all, but a full century later, under a king named Jeroboam II. The same kind of dating dispute surrounds an adjacent structure at the site, a storeroom that yielded dozens of inscribed potsherds, administrative receipts, mostly, recording shipments of oil and wine. 63 to 68 of them were recovered, depending on which published count is used. Excavators assigned the building itself to Ahab's period, but paleographic analysis of the writing on the sherds points to a much later date, the reign of Jeroboam II, or possibly the king who followed him, Menahem. One respected epigrapher has called the case for Jeroboam II's reign compelling. If the ostraca can be separated from the building that held them by a century, the same caution has to apply to the ivory. A find located near a structure attributed to one king does not automatically date to that king's reign. There is one genuinely strong anchor in the debris, an alabaster jar found with one of the larger ivory pieces bearing the name of an Egyptian pharaoh whose reign overlaps Ahab's almost exactly. That is a real synchronism, and it deserves to be named as one. But it dates a single jar. It does not date the rest of the cache, and it cannot settle the argument over the low-relief group by itself. Even the assumption that the ivories are Phoenician imports at all has been challenged. One recent argument holds that there is no direct archaeological evidence proving Phoenician manufacture or Phoenician origin for the Samaria ivories specifically, that the label, Phoenician, like the label Ahab, may be doing more organizing work than the evidence on its own supports. Two further complications sit underneath all of this, and neither one has been resolved. The first concerns the building itself. The traditional reading, going back to the original excavation, holds that Omri built the first palace, and Ahab expanded it in a second, distinct phase, the phase that supposedly held the ivory house. But at least two later archaeologists have challenged that reading directly. One argues that the two building periods were never separate royal projects at all, but a single continuous plan, meaning the whole two-phase framework. The ivory attribution depends on maybe a modern reconstruction, rather than a fact recovered from the walls themselves. Another goes further, arguing that the larger second-phase palace does not belong to Ahab at all, but to a considerably later period, well after the Omride dynasty had ended. If that is correct, the very ground the ivory house is supposed to stand on shifts out from under Ahab's reign entirely. The second complication is the far larger shadow cast by Nimrud. The vast majority of Levantine ivory carvings from this era were not found in the Levant at all. They were found in Assyrian cities, carried there as tribute, spoils, or commissioned work. Samaria's cache is the largest such assemblage found in a Levantine capital, still under its own king's control, which makes it valuable, but also makes it an outlier that invites overreading. One theory held that the Nimrud ivories were themselves looted from Ahab's collection at some later date. That theory has been set aside. Stylistic comparison shows the Assyrian pieces, despite sharing subject matter, were carved in a distinctly different manner, arguing against a single shared origin point. What remains, after all of this, is not a discredited discovery. The ivory is real. The keying letters are real. The building phases are real, and the pottery receipts are real. What is not settled is the one connection the popular telling assumes without noticing. It assumes it. That this specific find, in this specific debris layer, belongs to this specific king, simply because his name is the one attached to a phrase in a single verse. The excavators who first made that connection were not being careless. They were reading a text that was open in front of them, in a period before stratigraphic method had matured enough to test the connection independently. The stratigraphic caution that would eventually complicate their identification was itself only beginning to be developed on this same site, in the later seasons of digging that followed their initial report. Samaria did not go quietly. In 722 before the Common Era, Assyrian forces under Sargon II brought the city's run as an independent capital to an end. A layer of burned debris across the site marks that destruction in the archaeological record. Whatever the Ivory House was, and whichever king had built it, it disappears from both the text and the ground at the same point. Kings never mentions its fate directly, and the excavated layers simply go dark along with the rest of the city. No demolition is narrated. No inventory of loss is recorded. The silence that opens this story closes it as well. What the record actually offers, set side by side, is modest. One clause in the Book of Kings, naming a structure without describing it, and one excavated cache of carved ivory, recovered from debris near a palace whose own building phases are still argued over by the people who study them. Between Ahab's death and the ivories that may or may not belong to his reign sits a full century, occupied by kings whose own building projects have left marks in the same soil. Jeroboam II reigned during that century, and a serious argument holds that some, perhaps much, of what came out of that debris is his, not Ahab's. Nothing forces that argument shut in either direction. The alabaster jar with the pharaoh's name offers a genuine point of contact with Ahab's own decades, and that should be weighed honestly, rather than dismissed. But a single jar does not carry an entire corpus of furniture fragments on its dating alone, and a phrase in one verse does not settle a stratigraphic dispute that working archaeologists still argue over today. What the Ivory House of Samaria demonstrates, in the end, is not that the biblical record was proven wrong, and not that it was proven right. It demonstrates something narrower and, in its way, more interesting. That a text can shape an excavation's conclusions before the excavation has finished testing them, and that once a label is attached to a find, unwinding it afterward becomes its own long labor. The sphinx carved into that first fragment still carries its keying letter on the underside, put there by a craftsman who never wrote down which king he worked for. That absence is not a gap waiting to be filled by inference. It is where the record actually stops.